Publishing a journal article, a getting started guide for graduate students. As we present this webinar today, feel free to enter any questions that you have in the chat, but we are going to wait until the end of the presentation to answer them. And there will be a recording available, so don't worry if you have any technical issues or if you need to leave early for any reason. If you do start having technical issues like the sound or the video going out, and you're able to let us know in the chat, our colleague Kelsey will be here watching for these kinds of issues. So before we get started, we'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm Hillary Miller. I am the Scholarly Communications Librarian at VCU Libraries. So while I am not the librarian that works directly with any of your schools or departments, publishing is one of the areas that I work directly with.
Hi, my name is Julie Arndt. I'm a science and engineering research librarian on the Monroe Park campus when I'm actually on campus. I work primarily with departments in engineering as well as physical sciences on this campus and help students and faculty with locating journals to publish at times.
Awesome. And I am Stacy Wall. I'm the liaison to the basic sciences for the Health Sciences Library. So I primarily work with folks on the MCV campus. And yeah, so we can go ahead and get started.
So I'd like to just quickly go over the learning objectives that we set for this webinar, which you will have seen probably when you registered. Which is also a good roadmap for the way that we're going to cover the content. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why and how we publish, and some of the ways that this is changing. This is so you'll be better prepared to navigate some of these changes that are happening. Then we'll look at some of the ways you can identify journals that are relevant to your research and start to narrow your options, as well as tools from VCU libraries that can help with this process. And last, we're going to define authorship criteria, or in other words, who gets to add their name to the paper, and share some tips for discussing authorship with your co-authors if you have them. So to start things off, we're going to start looking from a distance. Why and how do we publish? Essentially, we publish so researchers can learn from each other and build on each other's work, with the ultimate goal of translating research into real-world impact. And to create that impact and to make sure that it's as positive of an impact as possible, the way the publishing process works is designed to do three main things. The first is to verify the quality of the research that the article is reporting on. So, for example, are there errors or inaccuracies in the article? How reliable are the conclusions? Is there evidence of other issues like bias or plagiarism or even fraudulent results? In the best case scenario, these kinds of issues are going to be identified by journal editors and peer reviewers before an article is ever published. But even after it's published, readers and researchers who replicate or build on the research continue the work of verifying its quality. The second reason we publish is to improve the quality of the research, and this is also done through the peer review process, where editors and reviewers make suggestions about the article as written or sometimes about the underlying research. For example, they might suggest further experiments or analysis that would improve the content of the article. And the third reason we publish is to share the results of the research with everyone who will benefit from it. This obviously includes other researchers who can build on it or whose research might be informed by it, but it also includes people who are impacted by the research results, like patients, and who can affect change based on the results, like policymakers. In addition to publishing articles, it's also becoming more common for researchers to share other parts of their research that help with these goals of verifying, improving, and building on research. And one example is sharing the underlying data that the article reports on. So some journals now encourage or even require this kind of data sharing. So as you're looking for potential journals to publish in, this is something you should keep an eye out for in the journal policies. And as you start to look for journals, just keep in mind that the goal is to publish with a journal who will do all three of these things and do them well. To verify and improve the quality of research, this means a journal with a strong peer review process. For example, to share with the right people, this might depend on where the journal is indexed, like which library databases it's included in. On that last point, another way that authors and journal publishers are starting to share research more widely is by publishing articles with an open access model. So whether a journal uses an open access publishing model or not may be one factor in your decision about where to publish. So open access is a term used to describe a publishing model where the research or research articles is made openly available, which means everyone can access the journal articles free of cost. And in some cases, it means they can also make use of the articles in ways that might normally require permission. So as an example, if you want to reuse another author's images or figures in your article, you usually have to get permission from the publisher to do this. But if the article is not just free to read, but also published with an open access license, this kind of permission isn't required, which makes it both more easy to access and easy to reuse and build on in other research. If we could go, forward to the next slide after this. So if you're interested in making your article open access, you have multiple options to do this. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach. You can publish in a fully open access journal or in a journal that has an open access option. Open access journals can be free for authors to publish in, but some do require authors to pay an article processing charge up front. Although this might be paid by an author's institution, or if they have a grant, their research funder. Other journals may not be fully open access, but they might offer an open access option, again, if the author pays an article processing charge. Neither of these options might work for you. For example, if you can't find an open access journal that's a good fit for your article, or the journal you want to publish in has an article processing charge that you can't cover. And while these charges vary, some of them can be in the thousands of dollars. But regardless, it's likely that you still can take steps to increase access to your article with a third option. So take a look at what the journal guidelines say about self-archiving or author rights or copyright policy. Even if your article isn't open access, meaning published in an open access journal, or with an open license, many publishers do still allow you by default to share versions of your article online with certain restrictions, like which versions can be shared and when and where you can share them. And if you need help finding or understanding your options for sharing your article, this is an example of something that I'm here to help with. And if you're working with co-authors, making your article open access with any one of these methods is something you'll obviously want to discuss. And Stacy will share more on having these kinds of authorship conversations later on in the webinar. Unfortunately, while sharing research is obviously an important step to take, many researchers do feel a pressure to publish as much research as they can and to do it as quickly as possible, since this is one part of the way that they are evaluated and because their time is a valuable resource. And this pressure, when it's combined with the model of using publishing fees to make articles freely available, has led to a rise in publishing scams, which are sometimes referred to as predatory publishing, which may be a term you've heard before. As you're looking for journals to publish in, you will need to make sure that you're not getting caught in one of these scams. Publishing scams happen when entities make false claims about their identity, their quality, or the services they provide to authors, and they charge publishing fees while providing little or none of the promised benefits to authors. These kinds of scams often start out over email, with emails that might look a little spammy, maybe with spelling or grammar errors, or that are addressed to the wrong person, or they're asking you to submit to a journal in a discipline that's unrelated to your research. Also, they often emphasize fast turnaround times for peer review and publication, and they may offer comparatively low publishing charges, maybe only a few $100s. And both of these things are designed to entice authors to submit without taking a closer look at the journal. And the fast turnaround times to publication are actually often indicators that there is little or no peer review happening. There are a lot of warning signs to look out for. So I'm just going to provide a few examples here today that I think are important. First is a journal or a supposed journal that makes false claims about where it's indexed. Again, that means which databases it appears in, or impact metrics, like a journal impact factor, which is something that Julie will talk more about later. And these kinds of claims can be pretty easily double checked if you have any concerns. And that's also something that librarians can help you with if you reach out with questions about a journal. Another warning sign is if you're ever asked to pay fees upon submission instead of publication. So pay up front before you even know whether or not they're going to publish your article, or if you get asked for hidden fees after acceptance that weren't disclosed up front. That's a really big red flag that something is going on. Another one that's sort of general but really critical is that there's just important information about journal policies missing. Although these start out often through email scams, it's fairly easy to set up a website and a web presence these days. So you may find that these scams do have a website, but they may not say who's on the editorial board. They may not tell you about your rights as an author. One easy to overlook factor is there a digital preservation policy, or how will the publisher preserve articles in the long term? And on that last point, scam journals don't have as much of an incentive to keep your articles available in the long term once they've gotten paid. So if you publish in one of these journals, you might find that your article disappears from the web someday. In addition to this emphasis on the rapid turnaround for peer review and publication, you might find that after you submit an article, it's accepted for publication almost immediately, or it's allegedly sent for peer review, but then returned very quickly and with little to no feedback. At first, this might seem great if you get peer review that says everything looks great, this is wonderful, or tiny insubstantial comments. But again, with the goals of verifying and improving, peer review can take some time, and very often is not going to result in little to no feedback being given to you. So these are definitely warning signs that either good quality peer review isn't happening or that no review is happening at all. If you have any concerns about a journal, don't submit to it. Ask a librarian for help before you submit if you ever have questions. And if you have already submitted to a journal and you start to get worried, it's not too late to get in touch for help. You can pause in the publishing process. Maybe you've submitted, maybe it's accepted and you're starting to move towards publication. That's okay. Still get in touch because we can help. You can also find more guidance and tools for identifying these types of scams on our Avoid Publishing Scams guide. And now I'm going to hand things over to Julie to talk about tools that can help you find and select good quality, not scam journals to publish in.
Thanks, Hillary. As Hillary mentioned, reasons to publish include verifying or improving your work. So finding a journal that has a strong peer review process and that can solicit feedback from reviewers with the expertise to give you useful and meaningful feedback is one thing that makes a good journal. And journals that are read by the audience that you want to reach, that's also important in terms of sharing, so that those are some of the considerations that you might be bringing in to looking for a journal, but they're not the only ones. So for those of you who are planning to submit for publication or who have successfully published in an academic journal in the past. What other things matter to you in terms of finding the right journal or thinking about what would be a good journal to publish in? So I'm going to wait a moment to see what y'all have to say in the chat. Okay, so I'm glad I waited a little while before giving in after the first 5 seconds, because we're getting some really good comments in the chat here that it's not always finding the the perfect journal, but one of the people had written sort of being a niche appropriate, that the journal that you're publishing in is appropriate for the specific field of research that you're working in, that those people are going to be reading it. But then there also is the issue of wanting to find a journal that's prestigious and well-known and recognized by scholars in the field. And although Hillary put in that warning that journals that publish a really fast turnaround time have that risk of being a predatory or scam journal, there is also the concern that if you are in a program that says you must publish this many articles in order to get your PhD, or if you're a tenure track faculty member and you're being told you must publish this number of journals in order to get tenure, it matters whether or not you're able to get that publication done in time for everything else that you have going on in your life. And so there's this weighing process between rapid turnaround and the depth and amount of change that the reviewers might want for a journal that has a more extensive peer review. So there's not really one size fits all in terms of figuring out what is the best journal, that you're going to be considering all of those sorts of things in your own situation. And then the people, if you have co-authors, they're also going to have their own considerations, and there might be some negotiation involved in that Stacey's going to talk about later. So knowing that there isn't a best journal in the abstract sense means that you're also have some freedom, that you don't have to be looking for the best journal. You can look for the one that's sort of the best fit for what you're working on. So one simple way to start narrowing down all of your options from the thousands of journals that exist is to be looking around to see if anything's been done that's similar to what you're doing, and finding the research that is along the same lines that you're working in, using the same methods that you're using, and reaching the same audience that you want to reach. Now, those questions of, has this been done before? Where else is this method used? Those sorts of questions are exactly the kinds of questions that you're already addressing when you're writing your literature review. So that list of references and all of the other things that you read in order to be able to do your research and prepare it in terms of understanding what it is you're working on, that's a really good place to look for the good candidates for you to consider for your own publication. So for example, so you can do this all yourself with your own knowledge. Now, there's a manuscript matcher buried within Web of Science that does the same sort of thing by pulling words out from your title and abstract and maybe checking your reference list to find journals that come closest. And some publishers offer a similar tool, but only for their own journals. So if you feel uncertain about your awareness of the journals that might be appropriate for your work, these tools can be nice. But just going to whatever database it is that you use or whatever tool it is that you use and looking for literature that's relevant to your work can be a good way for you to build the awareness of what journals are really going to be a good fit for your work. So once you have that short list of candidate journals, then you can go to the journal itself. And going there is going to give you some additional information. Hillary mentioned that there are going to be things that you can sort of look at to see what sort of, to sort of verify, yes, this is a legitimate journal, it's not a scam. But there are also pieces of information there that can help you make sure that it is really a good fit. So you can look at what articles have been published recently, because it may be that the journal has shifted its focus. And even though you have a whole bunch of things in your reference list from 5 to 10 years ago that are relevant to your work, when you start looking at what's been publishing more recently, it may no longer be as good of a fit as it used to be. And then looking at the instructions for authors, you might see that there might be something that could be a problem, that if you have confidential data and it's a journal that is has a strong open data policy, it might be that you either have to contact the editor or work or maybe look for a different journal. And then you can look at things like the editorial board and the information about the journal itself to make sure that its intended audience is matching the audience that you're trying to reach. In addition, if you are interested in open access, you can look at the details of its policies, even if it's not an open access journal, to see how easy would it be for you to share your information openly, and how long might the journal make you wait before you're able to do that? Because a lot of journals that are not open access will let you post it, but they have a waiting period. So those are things you can get without having to go to the library or look at a library tool. But as we promised in the publicity for this webinar, we're going to show you some resources that VCU Libraries has to help you select a journal. So I'm going to give you the names of some tools that you can use. And those databases are listed on the database list on the library's website. So if you go to the homepage and click on databases, you can find them there. And then they're also listed on the library's research guide for faculty to prepare for promotion. There's a where to publish page. And I'll put a link to that in the chat, and that has links to the 3 tools that I'm going to be talking about. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on any one of these tools because these tools aren't necessarily going to be applicable to everyone here. And if you want more details, you can contact your subject librarian or contact any of the 3 of us on how to use them. So the first tool I want to show you is Cabell's. It's no relation to Cabell Library, other than that we pay to have access to it. And it's a directory of journals and publishers. So going back to what Hillary mentioned about publishing scams, it has a set of what they call predatory reports, which are about journals that have some of the warning signs that they might be scams. So if you have concerns about a journal, you can go into Cabell's and search for the journal on the list. Now, because there are so many scams cropping up, and the people who are running these scams sometimes want to hide what they're doing, and so they'll change their names and change focus, the predatory reports is never going to be complete, but it does give you one way of you pretty quickly saying, oh, I don't have to go through and look at the details on the website. This already has a whole bunch of red flags. Now, one other thing you can do in the predatory reports, if you're seeing something you're uncertain about, is to use the advanced search and look for the publisher rather than the name of the particular journal, because some of these scam publishers will just keep adding more and more journals as they get bigger and bigger email lists across different subjects of people who they think they'll be able to scam. Now, on the other side, the side of legitimate journals, Cabell's has what they call journalytics. And these are reports based on surveys that they've done of journals and journal editors to summarize how the peer review process works, and things like what fraction of the submissions are published and how quickly the publication process is. So that can give you some of that information about the peer review and on sort of both sides of both how quick it is if you're on a tight timeline, but also how difficult it is if you really care more about the peer review being extensive and having a process where you're getting that feedback to improve your work. So that's all very useful for that verification part of peer review. One limitation of Cabell's is that even among legitimate journals, it's incomplete. Either a journal won't be listed there because it's not within the scope of Cabell's, or it will have a journal listed, but it will be missing some of the information that you were hoping to see in the report, because if the journal didn't send back a survey or didn't fill out the survey completely, they're not necessarily going to be able to tell you how long the turnaround time is or what the acceptance rate is if they didn't get that information from the journal. So we have another directory called Ulrichs Web, which in my experience tends to have a lot more journals included in it, but it gives less information about each journal. It gives some basic information about things like how long the journal has been around and what the publisher is, and maybe some information about how to contact the editor, which a lot of that you could get from the journal's website. But one thing that it has that is especially useful is that it has an area where you can see what library databases it's indexed in. And this can give you kind of a very rough idea of the journal's reputation. So if a journal is indexed in more library databases, especially more library databases that you've heard of, then it's sort of a sign that this is more widely read and that there's more interest in it than a journal that's indexed in less databases. Now, there's some problems with that in terms of new journals don't necessarily get indexed as soon as they're started, even if they're very good journals, but it can give you a very crude idea about reputation. Now, there are some other tools that are more well known for the way of getting information about reputation, and they're a little bit less crude, but they still are somewhat crude. So the one that I'm going to talk about next is the journal impact factor. And that comes from the journal citation reports, which are in Insights. This is all sort of built upon the Web of Science database. If you're a science person, you probably have heard of Web of Science. And so for people who really value prestige and finding the most selective journals that are most widely cited, journal citation reports, which have this number called the impact factor, that's a place where you could go and see a ranked list of journals based on their impact factors. So, but then the question is, well, what is an impact factor? How do they measure impact? And so if we look at what they actually give as their computation for impact, they're looking at the number of items. They're taking all of the items published in a particular year. So if you look at the figure here, in this case, it's items published in 2019 or items published in 2017 and 2018, and then counting up all of the times in 2019 that those items published in those 2 years were cited. So it's basically looking back 2 years and then seeing, okay, in the next year after that, how many times was it cited? So it's going to be changing over time. It can go up and down because it's always sort of based on 1 year looking at the previous 2 years. But the bottom line is it's based on how often a journal is being cited by other journals that are indexed in Web of Science. And that divides it out by the number of articles that were published, so it can be equalized so that you don't get a higher impact factor just for publishing more articles. But basically, when you're looking at journals that are ranked by impact factor, what they're getting at is how much impact the journal is having in terms of being cited in other journals that are indexed in this database, which means that it's not including the kind of impact that might be directly on society, for example, on patients or on students or whatever group the research might be relevant to. And it misses other kinds of impact that aren't being measured there. In addition to that, the data that is forming this citation counting is Science Citation Index and Social Science Citation Index. So if you were to try to look for the impact factor of a music journal or an art journal or drama journal, if it's listed there at all, is going to probably have a low impact factor just because there aren't many music or art or drama journals that are included in this database. So all of those citations the journal would be getting wouldn't get counted for this impact factor. So if you work in science or medicine or another area that Web of Science covers well, the journal impact factor can give you another piece of information to help you decide which journal is better for you. Probably after you've already narrowed down your selection to a reasonable list of journals. But despite its name as the impact factor, it's not necessarily going to tell you which journal would give you the highest impact. Now, there are other tools, some free tools out on the web, like SCImago, which is based on data from Scopus, and the H5 index in Google Scholar Metrics, which is based on the citations in Google Scholar. All of these are still basing themselves on citation impact. So they have some of the same limitations as the impact factor in terms of this is impact based on citation counting, even if the number is computed in a different way. And it's going to be limited by what journals are included or excluded from the underlying data to count the citations. So going back to what we talked about earlier, the best journal according to a ranking list by citations or by some other characteristic of the journal is probably not the only consideration that you would have in choosing a journal, that you're likely to have other things that you care about aside from just how well cited is this journal. So you're going to be wanting to put all of those considerations in place, not just one or the other. And during this whole presentation, I keep saying you in terms of you need to consider all of these different things, not just one thing or another. That you is describing a decision that you're making. But if you're a graduate student, you might be working in conjunction with a faculty member, or if you're a faculty member, often you'll be working with graduate students or with colleagues. And so the decisions about where to publish often are made jointly with authors weighing in on which factors they think are more important for this. You know, is it more important to get in a high impact journal because someone was trying to get an award and wants to, and that they think that will help them win awards, or someone more interested in getting published somewhere that has a quick turnaround time because they're on some sort of clock, either for graduation or for tenure. And so it ends up being somewhat of a negotiation on where to publish. And then to add to the complexity of that conversation, who is at that table and even is getting counted as an author is a conversation to have, to think about whose contributions are going to matter and who should have a right to weigh in on this. And for that, I'm going to turn over to Stacy, who will talk about authorship.
Great, thank you, Julie. Okay, so we are talking about now this idea of who gets to be on the paper. And so Authorship Convention differs by discipline. So primarily, I'm going to be speaking about the order and things will be most applicable to the sciences, but all of the criteria for authorship is broadly applicable. And so when we think about who gets to be on the paper, the two people that are usually the easiest to identify are the first author and the last author. The first author tends to be the person who did the bulk of the work. So in most labs, you would consider that to be the graduate student or the postdoc whose project is really what's being written up in this paper. And then the senior author or the corresponding author is most often the last author. And so those are two conventions that are usually pretty easy to identify within a research group, but they're often not the only people who are working on a given project. And so how do we decide who contributed or what that contribution was and when that merits authorship? And so there's a few sources that you can refer to get guidance on this. Most journal websites will have information listed in their submission process about authorship and author criteria. The ones that I have listed here are Nature. And the reason that I have the link to Nature specifically is that they talk extensively about an author contribution statement, which is something that journals are asking authors to submit more broadly. And so we'll talk a little bit about what goes into that statement in a minute. But when you want to refer to a journal specifically, that is a great one. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has also published a list of criteria that you can refer to when trying to decide, are you an author or are you not? And as well as the APA Student Science Council. And so in all of these, one of the considerations that they talk about are, did you make a substantial contribution? And so substantial contribution can be actual experimentation, the work, the conceptualization or design of the project. It can be any one of those things. And that is the first benchmark of, did you make a contribution in one of these areas? The next thing that the ICJME criteria list is, did you write that part of the paper? And so if you're involved in the design and the conceptualization of the project, are you also involved in the writing of the introduction or the methods? Is there a part of the paper that you can say, this is where I contributed and I wrote this portion? If you are not the writer of that portion, are you involved heavily in the editing process? Sometimes as a group, we designate one person to write because they're a great writer or because they have the time to do that work. But if it's your part of the project, are you actively involved in making sure that what was written accurately reflects the work that was done in that area? And lastly, did you approve the final version of the article in going to publication? And so if you're listed on the paper, that is absolutely something that you should be doing as part of the submission process. And so when we think about everyone in our group and whether or not they can answer these questions in the affirmative, a tool that you can use in order to determine that is to try to write this author contribution statement. So this is 1 to 2 sentences that would go in with the submission of your paper that describes what each individual person did on the project. And so an example might be, Stacy Wall worked on the initial conceptualization of the idea and the planning of the experiments, and then wrote the contributing sections of the methods that were applicable to those parts. Okay, that talks about the contribution that was made, and it mentions that I did write or heavily contribute to that part of the paper. So when you have a group of people and you're trying to decide who is on the paper and who should just be mentioned maybe in the acknowledgements of the paper as having worked on the project, but maybe not significantly, this is a great tool to have you or your colleagues write to honestly reflect on their contribution to the project. And then the biggest thing to do with that statement is to really make sure that you're talking about this early on in your project. So you can look for the publication area and the actual journal that you're publishing in might shift as a project is going. You might be aiming for one thing, and then as you're doing it, you realize that you're using confidential data, like Julie mentioned. And so that particular journal that you had your eye on might no longer be a good fit. Or as different individuals come into the project and make substantive contributions, you might need to target a journal that has a faster turnaround time because they're a master's student and they want to get on a paper before they graduate. And so talking about who is on the paper, what are their goals, where are we targeting to publish early and often is good practice so that when you get to the point of submission, it's not a source of conflict for the group. And so we suggest that talking early, talking often, and to really write it down. So write those author contribution statements as you are doing your work so that when you go to submit, you are prepared to easily discuss who will be on the paper and how you will demonstrate that. So my section is definitely the quickest to discuss because it is it just is. So I'm going to open it up to questions now because that is the conclusion of our presentation. And I know that during the talk, we had a couple questions about open access. So I thought that we could throw it back, Hillary, and start there in terms of answering some of those questions. But if anyone has additional questions about the different ways to evaluate journals or about the author contribution process, while we're discussing open access, please just go ahead and put them in the chat so that we can make sure that we get to them.
Awesome. So I'll start with the first question that is faster to answer. The question was, does VCU have a fund or a program to help with publishing fees? We do not in the libraries. We previously did, and we ended up having to close out that fund just based on funding concerns. So the question of where this money comes from is obviously critical, and especially for graduate students or early career researchers. It's possible I have heard anecdotally in some cases, sometimes a department, a lab, a research team can find some funding available to support fees on a case-by-case basis. So if you are interested in a journal that has a publishing fee, I really think it doesn't hurt to just ask around, ask colleagues, ask advisors, ask, folks in your administrative office. But this, may not be something that you have available to you. If you find yourself working with colleagues at other institutions ever, definitely double check and make sure to talk with them, because some libraries, some institutions do have these available. And, if you're going 50-50, you're both authors, their institution may be willing to cover their half of it. One of the ways that we recommend folks to think about, or get access to the funding for these kinds of costs is if you have grant funding. Now, again, this may not be as applicable yet for graduate students, but many publishers and more publishers are allowing these kinds of costs to be written in to a grant budget. And you may not know exactly how much you need, but you just sort of, estimate and request a certain amount of money. It's, a similar concept to if you needed funding in the grant to make sure that you could share and preserve your data online over time. It's a part of, making sure that the research gets out there. And I'll also add, there are more and more grant funders who require you to share parts of your research if you've received funding. I mentioned 3 different ways you could make your work open access. That third one's just the self-archiving policy. And that is what a lot of folks who get funding from the federal government do to meet requirements about what they call public access to the results of research, which is, when they submit to a journal, they let the publisher know they are under a grant funder requirement. And the publisher allows them to archive the copy as is required. The other question was about open access. So how has the open access model impacted publishing for scholars? Is it easier to publish an article via open access journals, which is a great question. Something I didn't mention before that I should have emphasized is that not all open access journals are scam journals or predatory publishing. Although there are people who disagree with the model or who feel that the model may be lacking in quality, because something is open access, that means it's not of an equal quality to other journals or articles. One of the reasons why this has started to become something that some people think is that these scam journals definitely do try to pass themselves off as legitimate open access journals, because that one type of model to make the articles free is to have a publishing charge up front. So when these journals are running scams, they are absolutely passing themselves off as open access. So that is part of where that confusion, certainly about quality, comes in. But the truth is, all journals, whether the journal is, you have to get a subscription to access it, or it's open access, they all exist on a spectrum of quality. So you may have newer journals that are being created, newer open access journals that are just new, and they don't have the same prestige. They don't have the same look and feel as an established journal. But they're doing good work. They're doing quality peer review, and they could get confused with scam journals. You have journals that publish with a traditional model that are really good and just okay, and would rather not publish there unless I have to. So, it's all a matter of quality. It's not just yes, a journal is legitimate or it's a scam, right? So there are really, really incredible open access journals that are highly competitive, that have high impact factors, that have been publishing for years. There are newer journals, open access or not, that, again, are just getting started and don't really have a good reputation or, aren't doing that high of a quality of work. So I wouldn't say it's easier in every case to publish open access. In the usual scenario, the best case scenario, the only difference in a traditional access journal and an open access journal is how the work gets paid for. Everything else should be the same. Peer review process and everything else will be the same.
I think I'll grab the question that just came in on it says on your website, you have a page for, quote, non-academic publications. Would this be a good way for first-time writers to get their feet wet in scholarly research and writing? So I think that's referring to the research guide, which has a section on finding the right journal. But then as you scroll down further, there's information about selecting academic book publishers, and then a section about non-academic publications. And I think one of the things to pay attention with there is sort of that preliminary paragraph of what are your goals in publishing? Because if you're trying to get into scholarly research and writing, and you're trying to reach an audience of academics and have that be part of that academic conversation that's going on in the scholarly journals, then you're not necessarily going to be reaching that audience when you're going to non-academic, non-scholarly publications, unless you happen to find some sort of publication that is a nice bridge publication that is reaching both the scholarly audience and the non-scholarly audience. So that might be a journal oriented toward practitioners, but that's being written by academics. But if you're trying to reach an audience of academics, you might want to be going for an academic journal that's read by academics. So but on the other hand, if you're doing community-oriented research and you want to be reaching the community that is being affected by your research, someone out in a public housing project and you're doing research on public housing, writing your research about public housing for an academic journal is not going to be reaching the people who are living in public housing projects. And you'd be wanting to think about, how do you reach those people? What publications are the people who are living in public housing reading, if you want your research to be reaching them specifically and impacting their lives by them reading those publications. So it's a matter of you thinking about what audience are you trying to reach and why are you writing, to help you decide whether a non-academic publication is the right place for you to be publishing, and sort of looking at the publication specifically for who you're trying to reach. And I think Hillary actually wrote a lot of what's in there. So I'm somewhat just reading off some of the things that she put in the checklist on it. But I'll stop so Hillary can add anything that I missed.
Which guide was it that you had identified on that? You can drop the link.
I put it in the chat, and we had taken the box that's on the bottom of that page. I think we had taken from the guide on community-oriented research or community partnerships that you had worked on.
Yes, and so that came out of actually a faculty learning community here at VCU several years ago who was focused on community engaged research. And the goal there very much was to not just stop at publishing an academic journal article and look at every other way you need to communicate. So I would agree that the other thing I'll mention that, I thought you may have been referring to is there are, like Julie mentioned, a lot more and more bridge publications that are meant to have, scholars with expertise writing for a more public audience. So there is one called The Conversation, which is specifically a blog where academics and scholars write about current events from the perspective of their research and expertise. So that is, another example of a bridge publication where you may not have a fully formed research project that you're ready to report on, but if you have something to say, if you are just looking to get more experience with writing, or a higher profile or something, that could be another type of option.
Yeah, and Hillary, I'd also add that there's several journals that have commentary sections within their journal. And so you can, if you're interested in commenting on your experience as an academic, or you're a graduate student or a postdoc who's looking to get some experience writing on a science related topic, that's also an area that you can look into submitting. Science often runs a series, particularly on the postdoc experience. And so that's an interesting way to utilize your stage in your career and write something else. We also had another comment or another question in the chat on, are there any links to credible editing or writing services on the library's website for academic scholars? And I'd like to start by pointing us to the VCU Writing Center, which has resources for students and postdocs in terms of writing manuscripts and public and grants and things like that. But I didn't know if Julie or Hillary, if you wanted to chime in with any other services.
I'm not aware of us having a listing of that sort of thing on the library's website, that I don't think we have anyone in the library who has that kind of expertise. One of the things that is I've seen more and more in academic journals is sometimes when you start looking in their information for authors, they will have a section there on writing or editing services that they recommend. And that sometimes can be helpful, not only because you get a name of a place that will do that sort of thing, but they often are doing a little bit of screening and vetting, and they're picking writing and editing services where the assistance is going to be from people who have expertise in that particular discipline. That's not always the case. I mean, it's going to depend on the individual publisher, but I've seen that. I feel a little bit better about that than about some of the directories I've seen out on the web of scholarly editing and publishing services, because some of those are sort of in the same line that Hillary is talking about with scam journals. They're scam editing services where they're like, we can guarantee that you will get published. And something like a guarantee like that is a huge red flag that they're doing something that is either unethical or just totally misleading and lying about what they're able to do with the kind of assistance that they would offer.
I would also suggest looking into what resources your department or your center has. I know that Massey Cancer Center has writers on staff with the goal of helping affiliated faculty. So that's something that's another option if your department has something similar, although I don't think it's incredibly common. Moving along in the chat, there was another question about the thought of, what are our thoughts on submitting the first version of a manuscript to a very high impact journal in order to get quality review before submitting to a lower impact journal? Is this a good use of our time, or should we be realistic with where to submit from the start? I would say, I'll offer my thoughts very briefly. I think that that's a complicated question. And I would submit to a place, I would look for a journal that is the best fit for the work that I'm doing. If there are two journals that have an identical fit, but one has a higher impact than another, then I might consider shooting for the moon, depending again on the amount of time we have to devote to the research, the amount of time you have to devote to the revisions as well. And the turnaround time of the review process. So some of our incredibly high impact journals can have a turnaround time on the order of 6 months, which might not be realistic for the intended publication.
Yeah, I would just add, if in the expectation is I potentially have a chance here, versus I think ultimately it's going to get rejected, I personally would probably not take the time with the ultimate rejection. I mean, the other thing that could happen is if you're certain enough that it probably will get rejected, you may not even get to peer review. The editor may take a look at it depending on how selective the journal it is and go ahead and turn it away. One thing you should look into or think about is the concept of preprints. There are a lot of publishers who will allow you to submit articles that have been previously shared online as long as they have not actually been published somewhere or with another journal. So these are called preprints. A lot of disciplines have a website, like Psych Archive is one for psychology, Soc Archive is for social sciences. And you can share, it's almost like a working version of your paper there if you want people to give you that feedback up front. Now, that's depending on whether or not people will take the time to do that. You can also circulate among colleagues. But that is something that more publishers are allowing, with the caveat, in certain fields, this may not be as acceptable. Certain journals will not accept something that's been shared as a preprint. So if you have questions about that, we can talk to you about that. But if you know the journals you want to submit to, make sure you know their policy on preprints before you start, sharing an article ahead of time.
Great. Well, we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to use that time just to remind you we are Hillary Miller, the Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian, Julie Arndt, who is a Science and Research Librarian primarily on the Monroe Park campus, and I am Stacey Wall. I'm the liaison to the Basic Sciences, primarily on the Health Sciences campus. So if you have any questions about this or anything else, please feel free to reach out to us, and if we are not the right librarian to answer your question, we will certainly point you in the right direction. So thank you so much for coming today. Again, a recording of this webinar will be made available, and there are still 2 additional AYR offerings this semester, which is the Advance Your Research series. We will have one next month on research, or actually in 2 weeks, on research poster design. And then again in March, we will be talking about secondary data and how to access it and use it for your research. So thank you all for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you at another AYR event.
Thanks, everyone.